This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening. My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. I would like to acknowledge that the University of South Australia meets on the land of the Kaurna people. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship the Kaurna people have with their traditional land. I extend that respect to Aboriginal peoples from other areas of South Australia and Australia. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia to our panel discussion, Slaves in the System. Tonight's event is presented as part of Just a Thought, an exclusive In Conversation series presented by the Hawke Centre with Tori Shepherd. Our panel tonight will be discussing the prevalence of modern slavery in Australia and across the globe, and how Australia can take a global leadership role in combating modern slavery. I would like to thank our wonderful panellists, Kadaja Blah, Sky Kokoshke-Moore and Carolyn Kitto. This event is being recorded and a video will be available on the Hawke Centre website. I encourage you to bring this to the attention of friends and colleagues who could not join us tonight online. It is now my pleasure to welcome Tori Shepherd. Thank you.
Sky, Carolyn, Khadija, thank you so much for being part of this forum. We're here to talk about modern slavery, and I guess we've been hearing a lot about slavery in general because of the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen statues toppled, we've seen protests around the world. We've seen our own Prime Minister acknowledge that he didn't realise that slavery had ever existed in Australia. So we've been talking a lot about slavery, but I guess mostly that transatlantic historical slave trade. And what we're going to talk about is modern slavery. And now, I really had not heard very much about it all until a couple of years ago when the federal parliament started looking into it. So I just want to ask each of you, let's start with Sky. You were part of some of these parliamentary inquiries. How do you feel about the awareness of modern slavery? I mean, do your mates know that they need to worry about where their clothes came from or where the bits of their iPhone come from? And if they didn't used to, has this process helped them come to terms with that?
Look, I think the awareness is better than it used to be. I mean, certainly my friends know about these things because I chew their ear off about it and I ask them about where they do their shopping and do they know where their phone and their laptop comes from. But certainly the level of community knowledge is nowhere near what it could be. Hopefully now that we've got a Modern Slavery Act and large companies are required to report on their supply chains, we're going to see more awareness, but really that's going to come down to consumers taking an interest in self-educating themselves about where their clothes come from, where their computers come from, where their food comes from even.
And Carolyn, you've worked a lot in this space, so I'm sure, just like Sky, your friends are very aware of human rights abuses in Australia and overseas. But in terms of general awareness, how far do we have to go to make sure people are thinking about that every time they purchase something?
Yes, well, I guess because I've been working in the area for about 15 years, my friends have all been hounded on this, and they know that at Easter time we put out a scorecard that says which chocolate companies are doing the best and encourage people to purchase from them. But I'm still amazed at how many of my friends will bring me a box of chocolates when they come for dinner that would be on the bad list. So knowledge is one thing, but then how do we embed that knowledge into changing behaviour? And I guess part of it is that people still have an image that slavery is not connected to them. They think of what it was like from the transatlantic slave trade days. They think of people in chains. And even though the power differential and the abuse is very, very similar, it doesn't look the same. And so how we get that behaviour change is still a big question.
And Khadija, I think one of the great things about going through this process in Australia is what gets named as modern slavery, as opposed to, say, some kind of cultural tradition that is somehow protected. So you look at that whole sweep of things, from forced marriage to servitude to dowry abuse to even FGM has been connected into this idea of controlling somebody's freedom. How did you feel once you sort of saw these things being termed as modern slavery instead of just something that is almost acceptable within certain communities?
I think I was quite excited, to be honest with you, when the Modern Slavery Act was brought in, because for the first time it gave some validation, I think, to a lot of people around Australia and campaigners like myself who had thought, like you said, that some of these issues were put in the cultural basket when in fact they're human rights abuse and they should have always been treated that way. And in Australia, that we should be able to do much more in fighting these human rights abuses, no matter what the cultural context may be. What is important is that people are given that freedom and choice and consent around, people being smuggled brought to Australia to work under slave life conditions, for Christ's sake. And we're talking about little girls having their genitals cut off. We're talking about young girls being married off to some old fat dude who, dinosaur years situation out here. We're talking about dowry abuse, having the money, extortion, and women even being lit on fire because of our dowry, a system that was created to show appreciation, but now has become such a weapon that the patriarchal society that we live in will utilize to control women. I find it exciting that we have something that actually validates these issues, and we are now finally able to put these issues on the human rights framework rather than a cultural framework, because culture is actually not an excuse for human rights abuse or gender-based violence in any form or shape.
Do you feel as though that cultural excuse, I feel as though that was maybe used on both sides, so within a community to sort of protect their own and keep the secret, but also by authorities who really don't know how to deal with complex issues like this and may even feel hesitant to go into a community because it might be seen as being sort of authoritarian?
Oh yeah, it goes both ways. Both sides will utilize that cultural rights approach when, within communities, what people tend to feel like is like, this is who we are, this is part of our culture, you can't tell us what to do. It's always been okay. It's like, well, food binding was also okay a while ago, we stopped. Drink driving while, it was okay, now it's not. Drinking while pregnant, it was also okay. A lot of things can be part of one's culture, but culture is not stagnant. It changes, we do better when we know better. Then when the other side utilizes the system, utilize the cultural rights argument, I think in essence, what they actually say is all lives don't matter. Because if Black lives did matter, let's say Black kids were getting mutilated. To say I'm not going to protect a little girl because it's your culture, well, that is racist, because if a white blonde girl is at risk of genital mutilation or any form of child abuse, nobody says, it's your culture, so we can't protect you. So in essence, what we see when the system says, well, it's too hard, we don't want to be called racist, inevitably, they actually already are being racist by doing that, because every child should be afforded the same protection, regardless of culture or religion. It's really as simple as that. And in Australia, under the laws, it's very clear that if the law says this is illegal, cultural rights or cultural issues should not be a determining factor in ensuring that we protect women's rights and children's rights. It's really that simple. It's not black and white. It's really clear what we need to do. The question usually is that people will have biases that they will project to ensure that they don't do the right thing. And I think that is quite unfortunate.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was lazy. And I really like that if we know better, we'll do better. So, look, we've started off by talking about this legislation, and as we go through the various forms of modern slavery. But Sky, you were right in the thick of it as a senator for the Nick Xenophon Party. It's not that long ago, although it does feel like a lifetime ago, but you were sitting in these committees, you were listening to people give evidence about human trafficking, and you were part of the process of developing this legislation. So can you talk us through what this legislation will actually do?
Yeah, sure. So the bill came into effect in January 2019, and it applies to large companies. So by large companies, the government means any companies with annual consolidated revenue of more than $100 million. Now, they can't quite put an exact figure on how many companies they think this act will apply to, but they think it's about 3,000. In South Australia, I've heard there's about 40 companies that will meet that threshold. So for these companies that meet this large threshold, they're required to investigate their supply chains for risks of modern slavery. Once they've done those investigations, they need to put together what's called a modern slavery statement, and that statement needs to address how they've gone about assessing their risk and what they're going to do to mitigate that risk. Something that's important to note is that while we have this $100 million threshold, there's an option for companies to report voluntarily. However, if they're going to report voluntarily, they need to meet the same reporting criteria as though they were mandated to report under the Act. So it's quite a large obligation for some of these smaller companies. When they submit these modern slavery statements, they will eventually be made public by the Australian Border Force on a public register. There's already some concerns around how that's going to work because there's no real guidance on how to make modern slavery statements consistent. So how do we know we're comparing apples with apples when we're looking at the reports these large companies are putting in? And so that means, how can we score them? Can we rank them or rate them? Like, how well will we actually know they're doing compared to other companies operating in a similar field? And there's a few things in this Act that are missing, from my perspective at least. There's no provision for a commissioner, for an anti-slavery commissioner. And this is a feature in legislation in New South Wales. They have their own version of the Modern Slavery Act with a lower reporting threshold. But what a commissioner would do is really sort of galvanise and harness the community and the government appetite to report properly, to raise awareness. Just as we were talking about at the start, there is relatively low community awareness about modern slavery, and a commissioner would play a really important role in addressing that. The other thing the Act doesn't have is penalties. And this is important because we know that where there's no penalties, there can be little to no incentive to comply. And so it's going to be really important for the Australian public to get behind the intent of this Act and put pressure on these companies to report and to report properly.
And I think that idea of a commissioner, journalists love a commissioner. You want a face, you want a spokesperson, you want somebody you can pick up the phone and get them to talk directly to a certain topic whenever it comes up. Khadija, I see you nodding very emphatically. What issues do you see with this? One of the things that I was thinking while Sky was talking was the naming and shaming is going to be great. I mean, sometimes people care about PR more than they care about the actual human beings. What do you reckon?
Look, I think it's about accountability. You need to hold somebody accountable. And without accountability, then we're saying there's crimes being committed, but there are no perpetrators. And that's just not a fact. There's always perpetrators. And there has to be a body responsible to ensure that we have accountability. But what is so sad with the modern slavery issues, whether it's child marriage, FGM, and the other types, is that for so long we have seen lack of accountability in this space. People have been allowed to get away with things. And then there's this, I guess, complacency in the community, really, where people think these things are not something that happens in Australia. We're a modern world, we're a civilized society. Why will you pay somebody minimum wage? Why will you take advantage of somebody? But I know of people who are in homes where they can't leave their houses. They can't choose what they wear. Girls who are scared that, if they hit a certain age, that their freedom or their body autonomy will be taken away from them. And there's nobody to be held to question over this. There's nobody that can be told, well, what went wrong? What's happening? There's no accountability. So I was shaking my head because I'm like, we need accountability, please. I think so. I like the idea of a commissioner, somebody we can look at and say, what are you doing about this?
Yeah. Carolyn, what do you reckon? Where do you think, is it a loophole for companies that they sort of, there's only this many that have to do it and they might not be able to be kind of measured against each other? What do you think are some of the issues with the Act?
So first of all, I would agree with Sky. We're pretty much on the same page on this, that there are things in the Act that make it weaker. So the lack of a commissioner, the lack of penalties, all of those things make accountability a very real issue. How modern slavery statements get reported is also really important. Are they actually going to be in a format that means we don't have to find somebody who'll read through 3,500 PDFs to see how we're actually going? But one thing we did manage to get squeezed into the Act when it became obvious we weren't going to get things like the threshold was going to be higher than we thought it was, when there wasn't going to be a commissioner, when there wasn't going to be penalties, when there was a resistance to a list of who had to report, we asked if it could be put in that there would be a review. And so in 3 years' time, there'll be a review, and we think that's really positive. So we've already heard from some big businesses who in their initial submissions said there shouldn't be penalties, who say that at the review stage, they will be saying that there should be penalties. There should be a commissioner, because if we're creating a level playing field, first of all, it's problematic that the government is reporting to itself for its own compliance, but it needs somebody to enforce that level playing field. So, you know, somebody might be running a restaurant in a restaurant sector of a big city, and they are paying everybody award wages. They're keeping them to the maximum hours that they're allowed to work. They're paying overtime if they work overtime. And then down the road, there could be almost an equivalent restaurant that is not paying minimum wages, that expects people to work additional hours, that might be forcing them to live or work in the restaurant. And you know, those two restaurants are competing. We say that we're an equitable society, but it's hardly equitable unless government is prepared to create a level playing field.
So one of the problems there is that, you know, there's probably not a restaurant in Australia that will come in over that threshold. So
yeah.
with the threshold, I get that this is going to be an administrative impost on business. They have to basically do an audit of where they get every part of everything that they're making and ensure that they're not subcontracting, because, you know, sometimes you can have subcontractors who subcontract, and then you're actually using, you know, people work in slave-like conditions in a Bangladeshi cotton factory, for example. But surely the smaller the business, the fewer supply chains they have to investigate, so the less administrative imposts. So there's that whole flag that, you know, they don't have to do the audit, but they might have an easy audit to do.
Yes, well, I guess there was a lot of debate about what the threshold should be when the Act was being shaped. And one of the reasons was 100 million was come up with was incredibly pragmatic, in that the tax department already has to release a report of all businesses that are listed on the stock exchange and private companies that have a consolidated revenue in excess of $100 million. It's not perfect, but that does give a bit of a list to work on. It's also a bit crazy because one of the things is that there will be Australian companies that have to report to the UK Modern Slavery Act, but don't have to report in Australia, because the UK Modern Slavery Act has got a lower threshold than ours. But their reporting requirement isn't as stringent. So what we hope is that those companies will take this really seriously. We hope that what they will do is that they'll report to the more stringent levels of Australia when they submit to the UK, and that they will also submit a voluntary report to Australia. New South Wales has a Modern Slavery Act, which they haven't brought into force yet, but it has a lower threshold, and it will capture companies between 50 million and 100 million. New South Wales is stronger, but we think that as time goes on for the Commonwealth Act, the threshold will drop, and the kinds of things that are in the Modern Slavery Act in New South Wales will become part of the Commonwealth Act. I guess there's people who've been working on this for a long time. So we started campaigning on this in 2011. We get a bit impatient. We'd like to see it move a lot faster. We would like to see the changes, but it takes months, and what we would like to see take days. And for every day that business, that government, that consumers aren't paying their role, more people enter slavery, and that's what we want to stop.
And that's a really important point, Caroline, because when we're looking at Australia's Modern Slavery Act, what I'm afraid of is it's actually going to do very little to end modern slavery in Australia. because the reporting threshold is so high. And so we'll have an act that's going to go hopefully a long way to addressing slavery and supply chains overseas, but I don't think it'll even touch the surface here in Australia.
Yes, it's correct what Sky says. There are not going to be too many restaurants with a consolidated revenue in excess of $100 million. Maybe if they're part of a hotel chain or a chain of restaurants, they will be. But if they're franchises or whatever, they might find ways to get out of this. I just think it's absolutely tragic if a business is focused on how do I get out of this rather than how do I raise the bar in our industry and in terms of what our business is going to do.
Indeed. And look, that was a really good segue, you guys. Thanks. Because what I want to do now is move from, the supply chains to these concrete instances of modern slavery that we see in Australia. And, we've mentioned some of them, but we're going to look at dowry abuse, about human trafficking. There's a whole range that we're going to sort of step through, but what they've all got in common, and Khadija, I want to talk to you about this, is it's the powerful taking advantage of the powerless. So what makes somebody vulnerable to becoming an enslaved person in all those myriad of ways? You're trapped in their home, as you were saying, people forced to undergo FGM by their families or their communities, the child brides and so on. Who are we talking about in terms of who's vulnerable to this sort of action?
I think, Tori, as a feminist, I would like to start by saying it's gendered. It's actually a gendered issue. Modern slavery is a gendered issue. Mm-hmm. Whether you're talking about workforce, who is more likely to be taken advantage of, women, tourists, international students. We're talking about people on visas. We're talking about women who have fled, refugee women, migrant women, women who have low English literacy. We're talking about those who are already vulnerable because of the inequalities in our societies, whether in Australia or overseas. Who's more likely to work in a sweatshop? Let's be realistic. It's going to be a woman, the woman with the kids who needs to look after her family. It's always a woman who's in these situations. But when you get more intersectional, it's going to be the woman who is low socioeconomic, who English is not her first language, who's gone through domestic and family violence, who is young, who is a migrant, who doesn't understand their rights and don't know their rights by virtue of living in a society where we have inequalities like racism, sexism, homophobia, and a whole range of other isms. We create a perfect storm for people to be taken advantage of. Because the young little girl, Muslim girl with the hijab who is going to school here and facing Islamophobia in school where she's told she's a terrorism, is there a safe place for her to say, hey, I can't go home because these people want to cut off my clitoris because they think it's dirty and think that I'm going to go around banging everything I see because I'm born a girl, I don't have a choice to what happens to my body. Because I'm born a girl, I'm seen to be that my sexuality needs to be controlled. We don't have the avenues for that. And she knows that. She knows that there's not a space where she can outwardly come out and say, this is something I'm facing and who's going to protect me. We also know that there are women and young girls who have been forced into marriage. And where's the outrage for that? Where's the alarm for these issues? The fact that we don't even get outrage tells you something, that we create the environment for girls and women to be vulnerable to these acts. And the acts of slavery, they are patriarchal by nature. We cannot actually get away from that. They are patriarchal in nature, in that they target us because women are more vulnerable, because we don't have gender equality in our society. It's easy to target young girls. It's easy to target women and have them be in positions where they can't leave their homes. I know women have come to Australia through forced marriage, or young girls here have been forced into marriage. They can't leave their homes. They can't choose what they wear. They can't have jobs. They're home being slaves, cooking all day long, looking after babies, looking after everyone. They have no freedom of choice. We talk about rights all the time in Australia. My question usually is, whose rights are we actually talking about? Because it looks like we fight for the rights of the privileged to continue to stay privileged. We talk about the rights, but it looks like we want to protect the status quo. The $1 million companies have tax cuts. When was the last time you saw a campaign for forced marriage? When was the last time you saw a campaign for child marriage? When was the last time you saw a campaign for FGM or dowry abuse, or the fact that we have little businesses out here that have, apply for visa for people, but those people don't get paid. They don't get paid whatsoever. They work in Indian restaurants day in, day out, and they're not even allowed to leave the perimeters of that restaurant. Where was the last campaign we saw around these things? So inequality creates the perfect environment for abuses to happen. But this is a systematic thing. It's the system that allows it to continue, because it's literally says some people are more important than other people. Some people are more deserving of protection than other people. And in its essence, it always will protect the status quo. So that is how we have vulnerable people who can't get out of these situations and don't even have the money to defend themselves or to fight for themselves. And in the case of FGM, little girls who can't speak up or fight for themselves, essentially. And the child protection system lets them down every single day.
What you were saying is so right, particularly about the gendered nature of modern slavery. I think the only exception that I could find, and I'm going to go to you in a second, Carolyn, is agriculture. People going out and picking fruit and so on. But other than that, it very much is that gendered space because, as you say, it all comes back to power. So we're going to start teasing out the different forms that modern slavery can take. One of the things is this isn't going to be neat because you start talking about human trafficking and that starts getting tied into debt bondage, servitude and all different things. So it will skip around a bit, but you know what, we're just going to start, we're going to start with human trafficking, which is probably one of the things people think about when they think about modern slavery, if they think about modern slavery. So Carolyn, talk us through human trafficking in Australia. I mean, I guess I feel as though the one thing a lot of people might know is there has been a brothel found where women have been trafficked into work in that brothel. So there's that, but there are other ways in which human trafficking happens in Australia.
Yes, absolutely. One of the questions which we probably haven't answered yet that people often ask early on is, when I talk about slavery, what do I mean? What am I talking about? What is it? What does it look like? Are there actually any laws or rules or international protocols and definitions? And the answer is there are. And the term modern slavery, as it's used in Australia, covers a number of crimes that are in the Australian Criminal Code. And what they have in common is three things. The person is coerced or tricked or deceived in some way into the situation that they end up in. So whether that's a young South Korean woman coming to Australia to learn English that finds that the person that has managed her visa says to her, oh, it cost me more for your visa than I expected. You now owe me, $20,000 and you'll have to pay off your debt before you get to go to this English school. And then they find themselves in a brothel paying off that debt. And they've been deceived and coerced into staying there because the person threatens that they will shame their family back home in South Korea, that when they go back to South Korea, they will end up in prison because they've worked as a prostitute in Australia. So that person has been tricked and they are now trapped. They are enslaved. It could be an international student or a seasonal worker who's being told that they'll have a job that provides accommodation, and they actually find, as was found in Tasmania earlier this year, they actually find that they're in a 5-bedroom house with 70 other people and they have to pay rent and the sewerage doesn't work properly. So, that's the kind of situation. Deception is a part of this person being tricked into modern slavery and doing this against the will. The second is that their freedom is taken away, and very often it's a psychological removal of freedom. So it's threats of family, it's threats of immigration detention, it's threats of violating visas, it's threats that you will go to jail, and so the person feels absolutely powerless and trapped in the situation. Very often cultural things such as shame to family are used to remove that person's freedom in this situation. The third thing is that they are exploited for the benefit of another person. And so work that we do should be for our well-being. It should be for our prosperity, for our life to be enhanced, for our personal development. But when we have slavery or slavery-like conditions, actually what's happened is that the person's freedom is taken away and the benefits don't include the person who is doing the work. Somebody else benefits from the situation that they've been put into, whether that's paying a bond or whatever. Human trafficking, in its definition, requires the movement of a person. Now, that could be from one side of a street to another, or one side of the country, or one side of the world. But it does mean that movement. And somebody who is trafficking people into Australia will often move them around to different parts of Australia in order to avoid detection.
That has to cover people who, you know, somebody might have trafficked people into Australia and then is moving them around within Australia to avoid detection.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And until you start to deal with really complex crimes like this, and we've probably got to realise this a little bit more since COVID-19 has come into play, that we are actually very much a federation. So laws around things like child protection, like victim compensation, aren't actually the same across Australia. And so it makes it difficult, because something that's a crime in one place might not be a crime in another place. And it's very difficult to prosecute under state laws a crime that has happened in one state when the person is now in another state. So even though slavery itself is a federal crime, there are many state components that might actually play into this. I think another thing that I just want to say quickly is it's really important to not have an image of a person in slavery as being somehow someone who's kind of the fading flower in the corner of the room that gets targeted. Often people get into slavery. One of the sayings we have is the trade is in people, but the currency is their hopes. So people end up in slavery because they have a hope and a passion for a different kind of future. And that's what slave traders trade off. They trade off a mum who wants her child to get an education. Now, that's a bit countercultural in some parts of rural India. Girls aren't meant to get an education. So this mother is actually putting herself out there to help her daughter learn a craft to have a different kind of future and make some money for herself. Well, they trade off that mother's hope. Students who come out here for a holiday in hope of a great time, who then find themselves trapped in living, working conditions that are almost intolerable. I've met people who are survivors of human trafficking, and they're not the kind of people who shrink in the corner. They're often the people who say, I'm going to give it a go. Or it's the girl who says to their parents, despite cultural restrictions, I'm not going to do it this way, who end up being vulnerable.
And Khadija, I think that's such a great phrase about the currency is hope, because it's visas a lot of the time. The hope that comes with an Australian visa for a lot of people from less privileged countries. I mean, how do people think of a visa? Is it's like, well, it's not quite Willy Wonka's golden ticket, but it's things that people do a lot of things to get a visa.
Look, at the end of the day, we have to realize in some ways we have our issues in Australia. Australia, though, is a modern society in the West, and people think a Australian visa is like a golden ticket. It actually is like Christmas has come and it's Easter and all of that combined. That's what it feels like for somebody who may be escaping, you know, an unstable background across the world where, you know, if you're born a girl, you may not have access to education, access to opportunities. So an Australian visa could be everything. It's a chance for a new life. It's a chance to have an education. It's a chance to have freedom. It could be a chance to have all the rights we take for granted in the West, body autonomy around a whole range of other things, you know, to be, I guess, to maybe be the CEO or the prime minister, or where, you know, your gender may not be as controlled. We take these things for granted. Coming to Australia for some people is life and death. It can be a life and death situation, you know, and, you know, so people do anything or everything to have access to that. People are desperate, and desperation is also a powerful thing. You talked about hope, Caroline, but desperation is also a powerful currency. You will do anything when you're desperate. We have seen people put their kids on a boat with no guarantee of where it's going to go, whether they will be safe, because what they're running away from is more dangerous. So desperation means that you're willing to trust anybody. You're willing to take more chances and more risk, because you hope that what is on the other side is better than what you're leaving behind. And this is where aid work is so important, and supporting third world countries and wanting to make sure equality is across the world, in all parts of the world, because then we're not having that human movement. People should be safe where they are. Women should be able to, wherever you are in the world, we should have access to medical care and sexual and reproductive rights. But because these things are not equal across the world, people look to countries like Australia for hope, a second chance at a better life. And people exploit that hope, that desperation. They exploit it. And this is why we need accountability. It should not be allowed to take place. It should not be allowed to take place under our watch. And to be honest, these things happen under our watch. All of us as individuals, as part of this society, it happens under our watch. Because most of us may know or see things that are not okay. But how many of us raise the alarm? How many of us will take action? We wait for governments to do something, but what about us as individuals every single day? What about our accountability and responsibility as humans, as global citizens, in able to call out this behavior in all forms and shape?
We have a huge responsibility to look after those who are seeking a visa here, don't we? Now I'm going to move on to, I think, one of the most disturbing things that I've ever heard about, which you and I, Sky, have talked about a bit and has been in the news recently because there were some arrests made for cyber sex trafficking. This is something that really disturbed me. Can you talk me through the cyber sex side of things? The idea that people can order atrocities from their computer in their lounge room.
That's right. I mean, when we're talking about modern slavery, it doesn't get more modern than using technology in order to exploit another person. And that's exactly what cyber sex trafficking is. And what that involves is people ordering the live online sexual abuse of a child on a pay-per-view basis. And we've seen reports from the Philippines, which is a real hotspot, unfortunately, for this crime, for a number of factors. Good internet is one of them. They've got great internet over there, relative levels of poverty, and a lot of opportunities. So what we're seeing is people, men mostly from around the world, ordering or making contact often with women, and we're seeing more and more frequently that it's the mothers or aunts or older sisters of these young girls and boys who are facilitating the online abuse, and men can pay as little as $15 to order some sort of sexual exploitation show involving young children. And I went to the Philippines while I was in the Senate on a self-funded trip, and worked with an organisation called International Justice Mission, which has been doing a terrific job in highlighting this crime and really bringing it to the public's attention. And while I was there, I went to an aftercare centre, which is where they take the children who have been rescued from cyber sex trafficking. And I met a little girl. She would have been 2 to 3 years old, and I had a camera with me at the time, and I made it clear these were just my photos that weren't going to be published anywhere, and they said that's fine. And so I raised the camera to take a photo of the little girl and took the photo, and then the adult standing next to her said to me, do you know, it's taken us months to teach her that when she sees a camera, she doesn't have to lift her dress up anymore.
That is just harrowing.
Yeah. And so that when you think of cyber sex trafficking, that's what you need to think of. It's not happening in some remote place. These are real children being exploited by men overseas, often in Australia. And we know it's happening here. You're right, Tori, we've had arrests recently. We saw Westpac earlier this year having the book thrown at them by Austrac because their mechanisms for tracing these sorts of transfers were so bad that they ended up tracking something like $500,000 worth of transfers to the Philippines, which would have been used for child exploitation material.
Do you think the internet, I mean, it's obviously impossible to imagine who would do this. Do you think the internet gives an additional level of removal that makes it's easier?
It's easier, and it's also, sadly, I think, an unintended consequence of Australia coming down hard on travelling sex offenders. So the ban we have on sex offenders travelling overseas means they're now turning to the internet in order to engage in this type of atrocious behaviour, and that's something that the federal government has recognised, and they've recently finally passed some laws in the federal parliament that have been on the books since about 2018, at least since I was there in 2017, making sure that when we're talking about the online exploitation of a child, that can include where you are in a different country to that child. So being in the presence of in the act now means being in the presence of virtually. So you will still be captured by these laws even if you're in Australia and the crimes are taking place overseas.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't the loophole something like you could be charged with the miscarriage, the misuse of a carriage service? That was like the only thing you could be charged with, of sort of misusing your internet
you could. There were some other offences like grooming offences that they could use, but certainly the laws are a lot more tight now, and there will be less chance, I think, of offenders falling through the cracks.
Good. I feel like with so many breaches of our privacy and so much ability to monitor our data and what we're doing, that they should be able to just swoop on these people. Now, Carol, one of the most interesting things in that horror, sorry to make you talk through that, Sky, and in that sort of horrible outline of the situation, is the perpetrators. So the family members. And that's not uncommon. I remember in a similar vein hearing that every now and then a trafficked woman, a woman trafficked into Australia, will herself become a trafficker, whether she's trapped in that cycle or sees the opportunity. So the stereotype of who we might think of as the perpetrator is just wrong, right?
Yes, and there's a lot of evidence. I can't imagine, I know I can't get my head around the dehumanising that somebody goes through when they're trafficked. And one of the things that people who work in the field with women and girls, and 80% of people who are in slavery-like conditions are women, and 50% are children and young people. It's not exclusively female, but it's predominantly. That's the statistics that show that this is a very gendered crime, and it's very oriented to people who society should be caring for and providing protection to, because they're vulnerable. Often a trafficker is known to the person. The example of, Liam Neeson Taken, it would be the absolute exception of how modern slavery actually happens. But it's very common, for example, in the large red light districts of cities in Asia and so on, for the madams to be women who themselves were trafficked when they were children. And people talk in the field about a phenomena called black eye. It's where the victim kind of becomes blank. They've been so dehumanised in the process of servicing large numbers of men, of having their freedom taken away, being drugged, being addicted to alcohol, that they get to the point of self-protection, that they just kind of blank out and they go into themselves to protect the little bit of themselves that is still left. And we shouldn't be too hard or judgmental on people who have been victims who then become perpetrators. It's something that's really broken in our society and our system that pushes people to the point of being able to do this. And whilst I have a huge amount of difficulty in being sympathetic with perpetrators, at the same time, they are part of this broken system just as much as victims are.
Well, we're on the stereotype scenario, Khadija. Going through this process of listening to all these senators talk about human trafficking, and I guess there's an unholy triumvirate there of human trafficking and forced marriages and child brides and FGM. I mean, that's all sort of, similar power structures at work. And I remember Liberal Senator Eric Abetz kind of said something in one of them which made it clear he thought it was just the Muslims. And, statistically it wasn't. I mean, actually, statistically, with things like forced marriage and dowry abuse, it's more likely to be South Asian countries. There was a high proportion of Christian people. So I don't want to change where we're pointing the finger, but say, how harmful are these stereotypes that go around about these sorts of human rights abuses?
In reality, FGM, for example, is practiced, did you know, in every continent except the where the penguins are. Now I've gone blank. Where the penguins?
Antarctica.
Thank you. Because guess what? The penguins are clitoris warriors. They are not patriarchal. They are about that clitoris life. Can we all just move to Antarctica? It's too cold, but that's not the point. FGM is practiced in every continent. So this stereotype that started off as being an African problem, not really anymore. We saw the numbers in Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore. We know even Thailand and Brunei practice FGM. All of a sudden, it's changed. We know it happens in the Middle East. We know it happens in the US, the UK. We know in Australia, white, blonde, blue-eyed women, girls who have experienced FGM. A woman I know in Melbourne, an Anglo woman who her mom found masturbating, and excuse me, gets verbal, a bit brutal, took her scissors to her clitoris because she did not like her touching herself. We've seen a huge number of women coming out of the US, white Anglo women who, when they were younger, who, because they liked girls, FGM was practiced on them as a form of, taking away their homosexuality. We have seen, for example, the husband stitch. It's a whole new cohort in this where women have gone to have birth and have a baby. I spoke to a woman the other day. She's like, while I was lying there, the doctor turns to the husband and says, "Oi, I'm just going to add a few stitches down here for you, mate."
To make it tighter for his pleasure.
Oh, yeah. Excuse me. Like, what are you doing? I think what we have to be mindful of that these practices that we talk about and, who we think is a victim of it, there are biases in who we think will be the victim and who we think will perpetrate it. And they are racial, cultural, religious biases that we bring into it. We have Christian cult Mormons who practice child marriage, for Christ's sake, who practice FGM and practice dowry abuse and practice other acts. But by virtue of being white, it's not as bad. And we don't talk about it because, well, it's very civilized, isn't it, if it's done that particular way? And it is harmful because then for people like me who want to protect everyone and don't want to exclude anyone, it makes it hard because people go, well, let's just protect the black babies, Khadija. I'm like, well, it's not just the black babies now. It's the Asian babies. It's the Middle Eastern babies. The white baby. Oh, what do you mean it's the white baby? Well, let's get into that. It puts barriers in terms of who we can reach and who we can't reach. But also I think for those communities that are cultural, it's another way to say to them they don't belong and you are the bad sort. You're the horrible sort. You are not one of us. You guys are backwards or uncivilized and your culture, your way of life has no place in our modern world. Rather than realizing that human rights abuse, gender-based violence, child abuse, it's a universal issue all over the world, no matter where you are. It doesn't matter what culture, religion, class system. These acts are perpetrated by everyone, essentially. So unless we come together in kumbaya and admit to the fact that we all are just horrible humans across the board, and in essence be inclusive and intersectional in who we target and supporting everyone, essentially, I think we just push communities to the brink and we push these issues to go underground as well, and nobody wants to talk. People feel like they really need to protect their community's interests versus the interests of the individuals. The amount of backlash I get in my work against FGM, for example, where people go, well, Khadija, you're just making Australians be racist to us, you're giving them something to utilize. And I go, that's actually not what I'm doing, but it is a founded concern that in essence, if they spoke up, if we acknowledge these challenges, people like Pauline Hanson would jump on the board and go, send them all back home. Well, what does that actually do? Who does that actually help in essence? These are kids born in Australia. They're as Aussie as my son, who's 5 and says to me, I don't have all day, mommy. I have things to do. Do you now? Do you? He thinks he does, but they're as Aussie as he is, and they deserve the same rights. And where are you going to send them to? Sammy he wasn't born in Sierra Leone. He knows nobody in Sierra Leone. Where are you going to send him to Sierra Leone to do what exactly? He's born here. So I think these racial stereotypes and the stereotypes that say that, these issues are limited to, Caroline, you're saying, vulnerability. I want to say these are people who are marginalized and oppressed. Vulnerability doesn't happen in a vacuum. People are not just born vulnerable. It's because we have systems of oppression and marginalization. That's why people become vulnerable. And until we address that, our stereotypes and race baiting and all these things that we come up with to other people, I think just makes those who are vulnerable, like women and girls, it gives them no way out of those situations and essentially sends a message that we can't protect you because we don't want to protect you in essence. We don't.
Look, Carolyn, I want to come to you now and talk about forced marriages. And, you know, you need to make a distinction between arranged marriages and sham marriages. We're talking about forced marriages. And the sort of example I had heard about was, you know, a teacher knows that their student, 14-year-old girl, is going back to the parents' home country for the summer holidays. She comes back and she's married, or she never comes back. Can you talk to me a bit about, first of all, the barriers in detecting this sort of thing, because it's in the family, and you know, we used to have this issue with domestic violence being seen as it's in the family, so we leave it there, and also the barriers to prosecuting something like that when the witness is then expected to testify against their own parents.
Yeah. Forced marriage is really complex, and it's one of the areas that the Australian Federal Police works on very, very solidly. I don't know if it's still up, but because I haven't been to any airports lately, like most people, but there's been a big campaign in Australian airports around forced marriage run by a group called Anti-Slavery Australia with the Australian Federal Police to raise awareness around what forced marriage is. And often an airport is a transport point, so it actually happens there. With COVID, it will be harder to take girls out of Australia overseas to get married, but the reality is that forced marriages are increasing in a number of places around the world simply because of starvation. One of the things that we don't think about in Australia, because we're not hungry, is how desperate people can become. If you are in Africa or India and you've got 7 children and the 4 eldest are girls, and the food supplies have stopped coming because the aid lines have stopped, and you have a chance to marry off 1 or 2 of those girls, that makes a huge difference to your family. It's well-being potentially for your family and for your daughter, because there may be someone who's going to be able to look after her better than you can. Now, that's not justifying forced marriage. It's simply giving the reason why it's on the increase. I've seen figures as high as 20 to 30% increase of the number of people who are going into forced marriage. There's a brilliant website for Australians called My Blue Sky. It has a huge amount of resources on it, and it works from the point of view of somebody who thinks that they might be vulnerable, to someone who has a friend, to someone who is a service provider like a teacher or a nurse or a doctor, to know what they can do and what the options are. And whilst I totally agree with Khadija that this is not a cultural or a religious sanctioned things, it does tend to offer communities that are closed, or communities that have high mechanisms of control over their members. And these sorts of communities exist in all countries and in all cultures. So you can find it in a white-faced community that has those elements just as much as if you were in another community. But what happens is, the usual scenario is that a 14 or 15-year-old young girl might drop to a school teacher that she doesn't want to go on holidays because her dad or her uncle or her mum or someone is taking them somewhere. And we've done a lot of education in schools around forced marriage, simply to raise awareness and training with teachers so that they can actually pick that up. A visa might require a doctor's sign-off. Those kinds of things are really important for us to be aware of how it happens. Marriage celebrants need to be aware that that they have a responsibility in Australia to make sure that forced marriage doesn't happen. So in terms of how we can prevent this, one of the things we need to realise is that everybody who ends up in slavery is taken from a community and they're taken to another community. And those local communities have a lot of intelligence about what's actually going on in that community. They actually know far more than they imagine that they do. So the more that we can get people to know the signs, the more we can train doctors, care professionals, marriage celebrants, teachers, nurses, even neighbours on this, the more likely we are to be able to stop it. And there are provisions. The Australian Federal Police can put an airport watch. There are systems that are made to work very seamlessly for women that are vulnerable. Education Department in New South Wales, for example, has a referral tree, and that tree can be used by teachers so that they know exactly what to do if a young woman or a young man self-reveals. But what we need to realise in the forced marriage scenario is it's not just young women. Sometimes that young woman is being married to a young man who is equally being forced into the marriage. But one of the things we also saw at the time, just before the Marriage Act was changed in Australia to allow same-sex marriage, was young men being forced to marry. They were gay, they were being forced to marry young women. It wasn't a racially based thing. It was simply that their families felt that there would be shame if their son came out as being gay. So it does happen to boys. The Australian Federal Police team is really highly trained, highly sensitive, and they're doing a fabulous job into intervening into these situations. What we all know is that it's much better to prevent a forced marriage than it is to prosecute a forced marriage, because the best thing is for that family to somehow be united and not for that young man or that young woman to be in a situation where they actually have to collaborate with a criminal proceeding against their family and parents. Sometimes people say, so if there's all this slavery in Australia, why don't we get more convictions? Well, it's actually not easy to get convictions. It might be easier to get a conviction of somebody having sex with a minor than a conviction of a forced marriage. And so that's the direction in which the prosecutors will head.
Wow. Every time I think I can't get shocked, I get shocked again from that, first of all, about LGBTIQ people being forced to marry, but also I had not thought about COVID increasing that rate and that economic imperative, which I'm going to come to you about in a sec, Sky, but I can see Khadija. Go ahead, Khadija, yes.
I got the numbers that we were looking for in COVID-19 and the impact on marriage.
Good on you, live research.
I will read them out for you. There are 2 million female genital mutilation cases may occur over the next decade because of COVID-19. And we're looking at an additional 13 million child marriages taking place between 2020 to 2030 because of COVID-19. So we're actually seeing numbers skyrocket. And what Caroline was saying is that in a lot of communities, because of the restrictions, people are hurrying off to marry off actually their daughters for survival. And people are also hurrying off to have FGM done because of the lack of accountability that COVID sort of gives them, in that everyone is so focused on the COVID pandemic. Nobody's worried about the gender-based violence or, slavery pandemic that we have always had. And, kids are not having access to their support, like the teachers who would have noticed things like this, to talk to social workers. All the protective factors have been taken away as a result of the COVID-19 restrictions. So actually, and I talked to the ABC about this just a couple of weeks ago, it feels like we're sitting ducks when it comes to issues like this, because COVID-19 has become this huge thing everyone is fighting for, and we're all trying to survive it. But that doesn't mean all those other issues and inequalities have not disappeared. If anything, perpetrators have utilized the COVID-19 restrictions and cover to then perpetrate and rush off to get things like child marriage and FGM done.
Yeah, and of course, economic concerns are what are going to drive people's desperation and hope, which is, we were talking about that being causative factors for a lot of what goes on. So let's step from, I guess, the forced marriage to, it's not really a subset of it, but it's a related issue, which is the dowry abuse, Sky, which is where, and this is particularly South Asian countries, even though the stereotype would be India, they've actually outlawed big dowries. So the way that the situation happens in Australia would be along the lines of a man has moved over here, got his visa, he marries a woman back in his home country. Her family pays a dowry, if that's traditional, whether that's, cars or money or whatever it is. She comes over and he controls her to try and force the parents to give him more. So she, as with so many things, this can also involve servitude, obviously. But he's controlling that woman and saying, get your parents to send me more. So it's an economic abuse. Sky, I feel like you sat in all those committees and more than I did, and you just keep learning about new ways of exploiting other humans.
Yeah, you really do. And I think that one of the real challenges that we have in this country is we don't have a good grip on the extent to which modern slavery is taking place here. So the Australian Institute of Criminology says that for every one victim that they've identified, they think there's at least another 4 out there somewhere. And so I think we're going to keep seeing different ways that slavery is emerging in Australia. But until we have the resources to properly investigate, the victims are feeling empowered and confident enough to come forward and report their abuse. We do have a support for trafficked persons program in Australia, which is run by the federal government, that somebody who believes they're a victim of modern slavery is able to access in order to help maintain their visa so that they don't become unlawful here. There are certain conditions attached to that though, such as, and I'm not too sure if this is still the case, but previously they had to participate in the prosecution of the person responsible for putting them in that situation, which isn't always going to happen. Caroline, I see you raising your hand. Has that changed?
No, not fully, although there is a trial being done for victims of forced marriage.
Okay.
But it's one of the things that we had hoped that the Modern Slavery Act would address, but it hasn't. So, yeah.
And so, it's great that we've got this program, but I don't think it is really providing victims with the confidence, the support, the security that they need to come forward. And that's if they know about it. So that's the other problem. How do we get the word out there?
Yeah, horrifying. So now we're going to another whole area of modern slavery. Khadija, did you want to add something to that?
Something before that Caroline said, but also Sky, that we actually have had like 3 successful prosecutions on FGM in Australia. I wanted to say that is a huge feat to have on issues like this. In the UK, for example, that has a much better system that has not been able to be successful. We have had actually 3 successful prosecutions. But I was going to say what you were also saying, Sky, around the fact that the burden does seem to be put on children and young people and those who are vulnerable to be the ones to report the crimes that are being committed against them. And this is something I've always struggled with the state of Australians' response to issues like child marriage and FGM. Because at the end of the day, those who are closest to us have more power, obviously, and to abuse and take advantage of us, especially our primary carers and those who are our parents. So the fact that a child can be put in a position to say they need to dub in, which essentially is what they've been asked to dub in their family, the consequences of that is being cut off from community and culture. You're asking them to lose a lot to then get a prosecution when we don't have the same burden in other crimes where the state will just prosecute. Instead, in these cases, we're saying, if your mom and dad come home and say they're going to force you into marriage, first of all, that young woman in the case of child marriage, we should be separate from forced marriage, which can be an adult being forced into a marriage. I think sometimes they get convoluted. But in the case of a child, I need to actually be aware that child marriage is illegal in Australia. I need to be aware that this is not something that's supposed to happen when I've been raised in a culture maybe that says this is what happens to everyone. My mom has told me stories of growing up and one day a husband was chosen for her and now he's my father and they love each other. That's what I have heard. How do we actually empower and ensure that information goes down to that level where that young woman actually knows this is not something that is okay. She actually has options. But when those options involve that one day you have to now testify against these people who are your parents, who you love, but they've committed a crime, doesn't mean the love has gone away. Your aunties and uncles are now all involved in telling you to back down from this case and back down from this white system that is actually trying to take kids away and tear families apart. I'm sorry, but we're not really giving people a lot more options in order to actually step into this system so we can protect them. We're putting the burden on them to protect themselves. And I think that it's a sad position to be in. And then when you think of the fact that we have a child protection system, Isn't that what the child protection system was meant to do? That we have mandatory notifiers who protect children, not children protecting themselves. That if mandatory notifiers across Australia, or child protection workers across Australia, if we were all across the board on all the issues that face all children, not just Anglo children, in that if you go to a child protection training across Australia, you most likely will not hear about FGM. You most likely will not hear about child marriage. You most likely will not be hearing about dowry abuse. So which then means they're not trained to pick up on these issues. Neither they're trained to know what to look for. I mean, I do those trainings for most organizations. And I'm just amazed that I'm one person who's meant to cover all of this somehow. I'm like, well, what about everyone else? How are they meant to protect these kids if they don't even know what signs to look for? The burden should not be on the vulnerable to protect themselves. The balance of power between parents and a child and a community who will then be invested to make sure this case goes away. And we wonder why we don't have enough prosecutions. Why will we have enough prosecutions? And the aim, and I want to be clear, this is something I'm passionate about. The aim for us should not be prosecutions in the sense that that is a punitive measure. I want us to have preventive measures. I want to live in a world where a girl's clitoris hasn't been mutilated and we say, we're sorry, we lock up the parents. A crime has already been committed. It's too late. We have let that kid down. I don't want to prosecute a parent for child marriage. I want to make sure we don't get to the point where a child is even married off in the first place, that we have protective systems in place to prevent, not wait to prosecute. Because by the time we prosecute, we have lost. And that to me is the saddest part.
Yeah, and I'd add to that what we talked about briefly before about people feeling that there is a cultural barrier that they're not meant to cross to interfere in a situation like that. Now, you guys, I'm going to just go to Carolyn for one area that we haven't sort of touched. Well, we touched on it briefly, but to go back a bit to sort of forced labour and debt bondage briefly. And then I'm going to come to each of you in turn. This is a question with notice to talk to you each about what people can do in their everyday lives when it comes to modern slavery. So we'll do that in a sec. But Carolyn, first of all, we talked about, 70 people in a 4-bedroom house paying rent. There was a story about backpackers here in South Australia who they were, taken out to the Riverland to get a job picking grapes. The job never happened. They were the guy who was meant to give them the job owned the hostel, was charging them rent. He ended up demanding sexual favours in return for more hours of work. There's fruit pickers that you hear about people subcontracting out, but then taking everybody's passports, physically taking people's passports, and then forcing them out to work. How does this slip through the cracks in Australia, where we are so regulated, where we have strict OC health and safety, but people can enslave people to work for them?
Yeah, I would have to say that calls for us to look at our visa system are actually really important in addressing bonded and forced labour amongst seasonal workers and overseas workers, backpackers. So, for example, if you're on a student working visa, it allows you to be here for a year. You're allowed to do 20 hours of work in a week. And then if you want to stay longer, you have to do 90 days of work in regional Australia. So fruit picking, something along those lines would be something that you might pick up and do. And a lot of these young people come here to have a great time, and they do. They might meet someone. They think, I want to stay another year. This will be great. That's the sort of thing you do when you're in your 20s. What that visa actually requires you to do is 90 days of work. So if it happens to rain for 20 or 30 days consecutively in those 90 days that you've put aside, that 20 or 30 days gets added to the end. So you might be stuck in a very isolated place without support and mechanisms for 130 days. Well, that kind of situation makes people incredibly vulnerable. So when I see us extending our seasonal workers program and so on and so forth, I just think there are not enough checks and balances to mean that the employee or the worker is empowered in relation to the employer, particularly in rural areas where isolation is really high. This is going to be an issue. And there's some really extraordinary figures. One of the unions has quoted that there could be as many as 65,000 unregulated workers in the Albury-Wodonga to Shepparton type area where we grow so many of our fruit and vegetables in Australia. Some of these might be generational. Their grandparents came here. They didn't get the correct papers when their parents were born, and so now the children are not properly documented. I think that most Australian farmers and producers in rural areas are really good salt-of-the-earth people. But they can become complicit with this, particularly if there are people running labour hire agencies that create that middle person that might put the worker into a bonded situation, or might be forcing them to live on a farm or into conditions that are not suitable. It's very hard to get these sorts of things addressed through the criminal system, and it's very hard for these people to get compensated in the long run for what's happened to them.
Okay, guys, so look, I'm going to give you, let's say, a minute each, but you could go over a little bit if you want. So Sky, don't take this the wrong way, but as I was getting dressed, I was thinking about you. Because of the fashion side of things. We now actually have a lot more information about the ethics of the clothes that we buy and whether there is slavery involved in the chain. But the problem is then I was like, oh, but I don't know about my necklace. What about my hairdryer? And I sort of went down this rabbit hole, and it reminded me that I wrote a piece at one stage about the Modern Slavery Act, which basically said the chances are you have in some way helped somebody be enslaved. Got an iPhone? Probably part of the slave trade, really. So what's your advice to people, I guess, a daily basis to just not help people become enslaved?
You're right, because the fact is we are all part of the problem. Anybody who's ever bought anything will have in some way supported modern slavery, whether you intended to or not. And so I think for people who are interested in this, there are 3 things in my mind you can do. The first is to educate yourself. So do your research, look at apps like End Poverty by Baptist World Aid. They've got a list of different organisations and they've ranked them on how well they think they're addressing modern slavery in their supply chains. Educate others. So once you've learned that, talk to your friends about it, start the conversation. Maybe you've bought a pair of jeans from Outland Denim, which are doing an amazing job supporting women in Cambodia who have been rescued from the sex trade and giving them a living wage to make jeans, or Dharma Bums who produce beautiful leggings if you're into Pilates and yoga and that sort of thing. So educate yourself. Educate others, and thirdly, support organisations who are working to end modern slavery. So organisations like Be Slavery Free, Anti-Slavery Australia, International Justice Mission. That could be financially, or it could be follow them on Facebook, follow them on LinkedIn. Again, talk about it, because unless we talk about this problem, we are never, ever going to solve it.
Very well put. Khadija, what's something people can do in their daily lives? I mean, look at you. You just sort of, you could just spout off an inspirational speech that, condemns the bastards and ups the heroes at the same time. Not everyone has the platform to do that. People listening might be going, well, but I feel hopeless. What could I possibly do?
Well, the reality story, I was one of those people. None of us are just born leaders or activists. I wasn't born this way. I think it started from really, realizing what makes me angry and naming that, whether it's sexism, racism, whether it's gender equality, whatever it is in our lives, we all actually aware of these inequalities. And I think sometimes it's as simple as naming the behavior that's been perpetrated and then starting conversations. I woke up one day and I was like, well, I'm born a girl in my home and I'm constantly told that I need to know my place and simmer down and calm down. And I looked at my mom and everyone around me and said, no, not doing that. No, thank you very much. And started challenging that. Just started around the dinner table saying, when a sexist comment was made and I was told I belong in the kitchen, going, no, I don't belong in the kitchen. I belong at the top office telling people what to do. That's where I belong. I think sometimes we complicate these acts as if they have to be big and they need to be showy. But it could be as simple as in your sphere of influence, in your family, the way you raise your kids, the information you provide to those around you, in your workplace, in your church group, your mosque, your temple, your sports club. We can challenge these inequalities. We can name these behaviors. We can put a name to it and stand in solidarity to those that it's impacted. It's that simple. It's how I started and then just kept on building up trying to, piss people off, and basically every step of the way. That's really it. But I think in this modern age, with information at our fingertips, so readily available about all range of issues, from what fashion brands are ethical to, where to support, social enterprises to support so that money is going to vulnerable women who which will empower them to have financial independence, to knowing that you could sign petitions to end FGM and to have more funding put towards forced marriage. We actually have no excuse. The question to ask is, are you angry enough about these issues to do something about it? It's really that simple.
I think that is excellent advice. Thank you so much, Khadija. Carolyn, no pressure. Take us out with a bang. What can people do in their lives?
So I guess one of the really important things in being in this area is not to get really overwhelmed. Like, it's really easy to go and think everything I touch has modern slavery in it, so I can't do anything about it. I mean, I grow a lot of my own veggies, but one of the things that I know is that the seeds for that, depending on where they come from, could have been harvested by a child. So even growing my own stuff won't necessarily mitigate me being involved in these issues. So don't get overwhelmed. And I agree with Sky. Get yourself educated. So choose a commodity. Choose something that you love, or choose something that doesn't really matter that much to you. It doesn't matter what. So it might be fashion, it might be chocolate, it might be tea, coffee, your electronics. Hone in on one of those things in terms of what are the things that you can do about it. And make choices. We are incredibly powerful because we spend money. Every time we spend our dollars, we are voicing what we think is important. So you will always be able to find a campaign somewhere online in relation to the issues of modern slavery and what can be done. So you have a voice, raise your voice and use it. The third thing I'd say is support businesses that are doing the right thing. This is not just about naming and shaming people who are doing the wrong thing. We talk about naming and faming because we find that it's in this context that we are going to solve this heinous crime. People do make breakthroughs. They do the right thing, and we need to support them, because unless we support them and profile them and tell the stories of what they're doing. So someone like the Australian company Outland Denon is a great example of a company that we love to work with. But if their story doesn't get told about how they have an entirely ethical supply chain, we don't know what good looks like. So we can sink in and admire of depression, knowing what bad looks like, but we also need to know what good looks like. So we are empowering the difference because of who we are in the world.
Name and fame, Carolyn. That is utterly fabulous. You did manage to take us out with a bang. So you guys, thank you so much for being part of Just a Thought for the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. And I hope that everybody listening has not only learned a whole lot more, and I'm sorry about the shocking things that you've probably had to hear, but also learned the power of positivity, name and fame. So thank you again, everyone.